6, I'm sure. We start the 21st of November meeting of the Council Audit Committee. First item is attendances. We've had an audit of Council G. I don't see my copy there, but it may come later on. Item 2 is declarations of interest. We all know how to do that. There are declarations. Item 3, questions from members of the public.
None were received, Chair.
Councillor G submitted some questions, but I'll read them out when we come to the proper parts of the agenda.
Thank you.
Okay. Can we go to minutes of the last meeting? Can we agree those who were present?
Yes.
Thank you. Approved. Okay. Item 5 is the audit completion report from August Maisons. Is that the right way to pronounce it now, Alistair?
It is.
All right. Over to you then, Alistair.
Thank you, Chair. Excuse me. And so yes, this is our completion report for 2022-23. Includes the findings from our accounts audit and the work on the council's value for money arrangements. Firstly, and in summary, as you can see from the report and the next item on the accounts, we haven't completed the audit work in all areas, something that we've been flagging to the committee for the past few meetings, and that won't be possible. There isn't enough time to finish the work now satisfactorily before the government's backstop date of the 13th of December. So consequently, I'll be issuing a disclaimer opinion on the accounts. And this is, I want to highlight for committee, this is purely a matter of the time available to complete the audit with the government's backstop date in mind. What is a complex audit, and there just hasn't been sufficient time to complete that work. It's not a reflection on the capacity and the ability of the finance team to help with the audit, as I'll explain in the explanatory information on the report. That's been we've maintained really strong, good relationship and had really good support from Graham and Dave and their teams. So with that in mind, I wanted to bring you a complete picture of our findings across the audit areas and highlight to you where we have and have not been able to complete the work. As you can see from the report, there are not many areas that are incomplete, but they do include the large and important areas, particularly the valuations of land and buildings and the group accounts. And hence the only option available to me in that situation is a disclaimer, is a modified disclaimer opinion. In terms of the headline messages from the report, as I say, the majority of the work has been completed, and there are no significant matters to report to you from the majority of the work. There are 2 amendments that the council have made to the accounts, as we highlight in the report. Both are classification matters, not necessarily reducing their significance, but they are not ones that raise any concerns about the close down processes or the control framework. Generally, they were matters that were classified in the wrong part of the statements in both cases. We've raised 1 internal control recommendation, which relates to the valuation of land and buildings and the methodology for valuing land and buildings. That will take some time to resolve, and we'll work with the finance team and the valuers to consider the changes that are proposed to make sure that they will address that issue. In terms of our value for money arrangements work, that is completed, and we include our commentary on the council's arrangements. In section 4, we've identified and reported 1 weakness relating to the council's arrangements for financial sustainability, which reflects the significant challenges the council faces in delivering its services within its available resources. Clearly something that members have been alerted to regularly by the Section 151 officer in the reporting on the financial position, and is not something that will come as a surprise to members, I'm sure. The other elements of our value for money arrangements work have concluded that the council does have proper arrangements in place, and we haven't raised any other recommendations from that work. So I'll pause at that point, Chair, and obviously happy to take any questions members may have about the audit or the backstop position.
Right, thanks, Question. I'll just, Councillor G has submitted a question about this. He asks, do we know what has prevented the completion of work on the group level risk part of this audit report? I think you might have said that one.
I have, but just for clarity, I'll be really clear that the group accounts, not just your group accounts, but all group accounts are really complex. And the work required to complete those is involved and detailed and involves consideration of the work that's carried out on those subsidiary companies. It's one area of work, but it's a disproportionately large area of work. And so simply it is the time that's available to complete the audit has not meant that we've been able to complete that area, Chair.
On behalf of Councillor G, thank you very much. Any other questions? Councillor Courtney?
I don't know if this is appropriate for this part of the agenda, but looking through the report, the value of Stretford Mall has increased as an asset over the past, within the 12 months of the frame. And I was struggling to understand that really, because at this stage in its development, its shops are being removed and it's being knocked down. It made me wonder, because we're talking about 12 months ago, and it wasn't in a good position then, and yet its asset is increasing. I wondered how our asset is tied up in the final thing. Is the whole thing, including the residential, split 50-50 between us and Bruntwood? Or does one half of the joint venture have more investment in the residential? Because I'm still worried about the retail side of things.
I think it is quite detailed. I think it's difficult when we're thinking of this is year end March 23. This is so the extent we've done works. I think it's probably something we would have to have a look at and feedback. I think in terms of the joint venture, it was acquired by the joint venture company with Bruntwood, for which we're both 50-50 partners, so everything's 50-50, whether it's retail, residential, everything else. But I think in terms of valuation movements, I wouldn't like to guess why it's gone up. I think what we'll probably do is look at the movement at the start of the year, look at the end, and I can feedback to you on that.
That's fine. To be honest, I was less bothered about the shifting asset than actually understand, more in sense of understanding our relationship with Bruntwood within it. Because I could imagine a housing development, which most of the Stretford Mall is a housing development. I could understand why that grew in asset, even though a brick hasn't been built. But I couldn't understand if it was just the Mall side. And I just wanted to make sure we were 50-50 on everything. We get the good things as well as the bad.
I think just to finish off on that, when we, through the governance we've got with the joint venture partner, so we've got board meetings, we get regular updates of the business plan and cash flow. So we're looking at, in effect, where we are now, where we're going to be through development and post-development in terms of overall equity that both companies Trafford and the company, we're looking at what the value of the assets could be over that medium term as well. So I think business planning and everything else is quite tight on it, but there's an awful lot happening.
Yeah.
Obviously with the future high streets, fund monies, and all the input that the joint venture is putting in on top of that, and the plans for residential development as well. So it's quite a thing to pull together. But if you ever want to look at the cash flow, we can do, because we've got them.
Right, lovely. Thanks.
Okay, anybody else? Okay, can we note the report then? Thank you, Alistair. You can stay for the rest of the meeting if you want, or?
I'll probably stay for the next item because it's linked with it with the
Yes.
yeah. But given that I've got a battle with the MCC2, I'll probably depart before the end of the meeting. Thanks, Chair.
Right, the 6 is the accounts, 22-23. Graham, will you do that?
Yeah, so I think what we've got here, but what we usually do is, in a more timely fashion, try to take the committee through the accounts. We do normally do training in advance of putting accounts on deposit, but I think given the retrospective nature of these are the accounts as at March 23. I think it's just really for noting. Obviously, we've had Alistair's update in terms of some changes that we needed to make to some of the statements in terms of where certain items were represented. So we've done that, and I think it's just a point of now getting the accounts approved by the committee. Then it'll be up to myself and a new chair to get the accounts signed off, and that will then draw a line with the 22-23. I think just to add to the opinion, I think from an officer perspective, but I understand to some degree that I think the conclusion is disappointing, but that's a consequence of, I suppose, really it's the national deadlines and the difficulty in achieving completion of the audits in compliance with the deadlines that won't move. And I think what we'll need to do as officers and organisationally, particularly from a reputational perspective, is just manage the message. We want unqualified accounts ideally, and that reflects well on the organisation. I think disclaimed accounts is one that we'll just probably have to manage. But we are transparent in our position. If I thought there was anything up with the accounts, I wouldn't be able to sign them off, but I'm comfortable that I can sign these accounts off as well.
Thanks very much. Any questions? Councillor Atson?
I hope I'm matching the right questions to the right reports because there were so many of them. I was just interested in, I think it's in this one where there's mention about errors related to pension assets, like what the GMPF did. That's an errors. I just wondered, has that happened before? Is that a really one-off situation? I wondered how that impacts us. And the other question was about, I think it's in something in there about getting funding grants, and I wondered how many resources you're using to enable you to get funding grants, if there's anything more you could do to get more funding grants. So I just wondered how that sits. Thank you.
Take the last one first, and I'll pass to Dave if I can on the pension fund assets. I think as an organisation, I think if I step back a few years, I think the difficulty we had as a quite lean organisation was in effect chasing those funds that were available. And I do think we struggled probably in the past. I think we have invested in particularly in our highways related side, such that we can bid for resources. And we do get them around the active travel particularly. So I think we have stepped up our game in that respect. I think going forward though, you think about the single settlement that Greater Manchester's getting, that's an attempt in fact to try to reduce the need for us to bid for separate pots of money. Obviously we'll need to keep sharp elbows when we're working with GM to make sure we get our fair share, but it should be a little bit easier and less labour intensive to get those grants going forward. Dave, you want to take pension?
I'll pick up the pension question because I think it's in Graham's report, but it comes from mine as well. So I'll pick that up. So the question was, has that happened before? The honest answer is yes, it has, and it'll probably happen again next year and the year after. The error arises from timing issues. So the pension fund produce their accounts to a deadline, as all organisations do, and at that point they put their accounts together on the best information they have available at that time. And then when the audit's carried out, which for a pension fund is normally in the following 2 to 3 months after that period, more up-to-date information is available that updates the value of those assets. So it is an error of sorts. It's probably a little harsh to call it an error because they were based on the best available information, and then there was more recent information that was available that indicated the valuation had moved. So what's in here, what's in your report and reflected is our estimate of your share of that, because obviously it's not known exactly whose assets. That's not the way the local government pension scheme works. So this is our estimate of your share of that, rather than being an absolute. It's very much an estimate of that. If that helps.
Councillor Carter?
Thanks, Chair. Does or could the status of the accounts being negative qualified, does that or could that affect the cost, the price at which we borrow money as council?
I think the short answer is no.
Reply short.
That's great, thank you for that. Anybody else, any other questions? No? All right, so thanks for that. Can depart on the M62 and with
Go
that.
back and forth snow, what city?
Yes.
That's going to.
Thank you, Bob. Okay, we move on to item 7, treasure management.
I just spotted an error on the report and it's got the wrong number of councillors for the Democrats and the Green Party on page 62.
Of the,
The accounts, I might not be on the right page, but I think sorry?
Yeah.
Yes.
I presume you just have information.
Yeah, so just to pick up the error on the it says 2023 to 24, and we have 6 with Democrats and 6 Greens, but it says 5 with Democrats and 4 Greens, which would be.
is that the year before or something?
I think it's wrong, because we've got.
Well, can we just leave it with the officers to look at?
Yeah.
We will check. I think
Yeah.
what we're doing, obviously, at that point in time, we'll check at that point in time what was the right composition,
Yeah,
but then we'll take that away and check that.
I think the timing's wrong and the numbers are wrong, yeah.
Okay, we'll sort that out and correct it if it's necessary.
Actually,
Thank you. Want that to order, Councillor? Right, from item 7, treasury management mid-term performance. Is that you, Frank, is it? Or-
Yes, that's me, thanks, Chair. So this is the Treasury mid-year performance report. So the figures you'll find in here will be the position as at 30th of September 24. So I'll just run through the summaries really. So the debt levels are unchanged, so we didn't make any repayments or draw in new loans during the first half of the year. The investment level at the 30th of September was 26.3 million, which is lower than the start of the year, but it's worth remembering that's the position at that day. So the council's investment position changes on a daily basis. The rate of return from investments in the first half of the year was 5.17%, which is higher than the 1-month SONIA, which is the performance indicator which the council uses to judge its performance of investments. The estimated return on investments for 24-25 is predicted to be 2.1 million, which is will be supportive of the council's budget position. And then the other thing to discuss, which is a change from the usual process, is we've attached the council's MRP policy or MRP statement. This is normally taken to budget the February council for approval for the following year. However, in April 24, changes were made to the regulation that surrounded MRP and the guidance that accompanies that. Most of that guidance as regulation is applicable from the 1st of April 25. with the exception of a clause around the appropriate charge for a expected credit loss on a capital debtor, which will apply from the 7th of May 2024. So with that in mind, we still require the MRP policy to be approved by full council, but when it goes in February, it will be applicable from the 1st of April 2024, as well as from the following year. So it's just for noting that this will be approved and ratified by council in February. The change that is specific for this year, I should point out, will be that if the council were to incur an expected credit loss on any of its debt facilities, so that would be a predicted loss of a return on a loan facility, that predicted loss will need to be accountable in the year the loss is identified, not when it is incurred. So, for example, if there's a 5-year facility and we identify a loss in year 1, we have to recognise the full amount of that loss in year 1, rather than in year 5, and rather than writing it off over a significant period of time, whatever, which we currently do, or we can't. That will be applicable from new facilities issued from the 7th of May 2024. Okay, that's me, Mr. Chair.
Okay. And Frank, any questions? Councillor Wetton. Well, sorry. Yeah, I'm sorry. So,
That's all right.
and Councillor Carter.
You've heard a lot of names during your time on the council.
Yeah.
Yeah, I'm just wondering, is this going to make a substantial difference to the way our accounts look this year? This change with the MRP.
I think what the MRP really relates to is any expenditure we pay for using borrowing. So MRP is how we save up to pay that borrowing back. I think largely no, but I think what we do every year, you will know as a committee, we've got the asset strategy, investment strategy. So that's a £500 million fund, whereby if we use the fund, we finance our expenditure through borrowing. So what we need to do each year, what we do is review what we've committed and spent using that fund to see whether or not our MRP provision is appropriate. And I think it forms part of the review, but I think from the monitoring we've done during 24-25 at this point, we don't see that the MRP changes will have an impact on our budget position for 24-25 as it stands. But obviously we'll be doing that review at year end, so within the next 6 months things may change. It's not 6 months now, is it? I'm just thinking of reporting P6 on.
You wish it was 6 months.
Yeah.
Councillor Carter?
I was hoping you were going to take slightly longer just formulating the question. I'm going to try and ask a question that links this and our period 6 position.
Yeah.
So I think what this report says is that for 24-25, the forecast of our earnings from investments looks like coming in £1.28 million above budget. And our period 6 reported overspend is 3.6 million. Has the 1.28 million or a part of that already been taken account for in that period 6 overspend, or is it a potential surplus above budget that's going to assist in addressing overspend as the year goes on? Does that make sense?
Yeah, totally. I think, and it's good to link the reports, but I think within that period 6 report, and I'll come on to this shortly, is that one of the positive variations that we're projecting for this year is the treasury position, and we have done in the last couple of years as interest rates have gone up, we've earned more through investing cash. So that position in the treasury report that Frank's just gone through is reflected in that projected overspend of 3.6. So obviously without it, the overspend will be worse.
Okay, that was a slightly longer answer than last time, slightly more disappointing. And does your forecast already take into account the drop in interest rates announced that will kick in from November?
Yeah, we included an estimate for what we thought would happen, and the drop down in November was pretty well signposted. So that we think that, I mean, it's that position is more likely to be affected by the council's cash levels rather than changes in interest at this point. But for the benefit from where it is.
Thank you.
Okay, any more questions on that? No, okay.
Sorry.
Sorry, Councillor.
Sorry, I was saying that. Yeah, just on this strategic investment programme, which we spoke about last time, I want to thank you for following up. Really minor point, but thanks to your clarification and saying that the money wasn't due to be received until March 25. There is a typo in here, but 6.7 strategic investment programme saying that further 8.2 was received in July 24 with an extension facility granted to March 23. That should read March 25 as per your email. Going back to the changes, in here references potential implications to TTIA has already been referenced. Are there any other investments that could be affected after the change in March 2025?
I think we'll pick the typo. I think in terms of the outlet estate, which that investment relates to, I think the thinking at the moment is that that investment and what we're targeting is to have a repayment of that by March 25. That's still, there was an update to the Investment Management Board this week, which basically said that. And the investment we've had over time there has reduced as the borrowers repaid sums. So I think at the moment the figure is about, is it about £3 or £4 million? 3.8 million. And at the moment there's still 2 properties within that asset that the borrower still owns, and they're looking at marketing and selling, and once that's done, they'll repay back. And at the moment the values of those properties quite significantly exceed the value of the loan. It's outstanding. In respect to the CCLA, the specific question was what? Sorry.
Just, sorry, the changes already discussed about the statutory override expiring in March 2025. Just following up on that question, are there any other investments that could be affected once that change happens?
At the moment, this CCLA one is the only investment there. The rest of the statutory override only applies to that one. None of the other investments are subject to that, so it's the only one.
Thank you, I just wanted that clarification, thanks.
Thanks. Anything else? No? Okay. Can we move on then to the insurance report? Who's going to do that? Okay.
Thank you. This is just the annual insurance report activity for 23-24. It's a normal format set out in terms of the cost of insurance, the claims performance, and then the market outlook going forward. Just in terms of the cost of the insurance, it's similar to principles as you would do domestic insurance and motor insurance. The annex on page 277 gives you a flavour of the various categories of insurance that cover public liability, employer's liability, and property damage and like some of that. We actually carry an excess where we have to cover the first amount of an excess, which ranges between 250,000 and 275,000. So we manage that locally. Above those, we're paying insurance premium where insurance will then step in over that. So that's the main principles how the insurance works. In terms of the actual cost side of things, table 1 on page 272 shows you how the actual revenue budget fared during 23-24. Because we actually had an increase in the number of small number of large insurance claims, and also a review by our actuary in terms of what amounts of money we should set aside for potential for future claims based on patterns, national patterns that evolve around the country. We recommend this is how much you should set aside. So on that, it caused a pressure of about £750,000, which overall we overspent from budget of 880,000, and expected overspend of 727,000. So we're carrying an insurance risk reserve for the potential to mitigate some of these pressures within the revenue budget. Within the insurance risk reserve, we carry enough to take for basically 3 large claims, which would be about 750,000. Within there as well, we also maintained a balance of about £500,000 for the legacy payments related to municipal mutual insurance, which is a consortium arrangement from local authorities set up in the early 1900s. It was wrapped up in 1993, so there's still some legacy claims related to that at the time. Since then, the actuaries looked at that, the claims have now dropped, and they recommended saying, well, you can release some of that amount of money that you've set aside in your risk reserve for that. So the overspending the revenue budget, we managed to offset some of that by drawing off 40,000 from the reserve. So we had a net overspend in the year, 287,000. So in terms of the insurance provision and the actual risk reserve, you see those in table 2. The insurance provision set aside starts off at 3.3 million, and just over 4 million. Again, based on the actuaries' advices to the evolution of the claims, and also some of these bigger claims that we've had, which I'll explain in a bit more detail. So we've got 4 million set aside for those potential claims. It might be lower, but in terms of as the claims evolve, we might leave that money. And then the risk reserve, we've got a closing balance of just over £1 million for that. Again, to cover those 3 large claims of any one year, we could draw out that risk reserve for that. In terms of the pattern claims, in section 3, that looks at the actual payments for claim activities. It has started to creep up over recent years. Not necessarily, we've got a fairly high defence rate, but we're finding that some of the claims, particularly around for high cost claims, we creep up because of the inflationary impact and the value of those claims coming through. So we paid out £675,000 of actual claims in 23/4 related to all claim years, way back from 1992. Just to put in context, but there's one particular high claim on a highways claim on that one, which represented 32% of that figure. It related to a very unique case of a highway trip. Unfortunately, the claimant was a high-end individual, so loss of earnings was related to that, start related to that side of things. We defended it from a legal point of view. We had the forensic accountants looking at his earnings, but in the end, we had to settle on that side of it. So you notice the number of claims creeping up from 21, 22, 209, back up to about 312. That just reflects the pattern back from the COVID times, 21 to as more traffic potential highway claims and that's that come back online. So same repudiation rates, the defence rates, we are improve those from 75 to 80%. So we're finding that we've actually managed to deflect a lot of the claims. So that's good news out of that one. In terms of individual claim activity, employees' liability, these things, they're very high value when they do happen. We only had one claim in that one, but again, just to give you the context of that one, 3 outstanding claims with a provision of 600,000. These are the types of things that might relate to a slip or a trip of an employee. If there's a school canteen, that's one of the potential cases in there. Highway injury, we had one serious claim that's probably one of the biggest ones we have. We had to set aside a reserve of £5 million potential maximum, and obviously we covered the first 250,000 with insurance fitting into the rest. That's a unique case. Again, we are defending that. We've got a strong defence on that one. It's a serious medical injury claim. So there's a lot of resource going into looking at defending it as what highways service have got evidence to say that they've met the requirements within the legal framework. So hopefully we can defend that. And then the claim activities as well. Trees tended to settle down, and that started to. It was a theme a few years ago. That's dropped a bit back from where it was, 35 new claims compared to the yearly average of 49. So that's looking good. And then the public liability again. That's where you get your claims for say breach of care. That's that within social care. Small number of claim potential high cost. So that's the pattern of claims. In terms of future activity, cyber activity, cyber insurance was an area that we were always keen to make sure we're covering ourselves on that one. It's still a very immature and maturing market in terms of the value of the potential for quotes, and when they do pay out, they're not necessarily covering a large amount. So we're still self-insured in that side of things. And we're working with the IT team, working on making sure the IT infrastructure is there and training staff appropriately in terms of risk management, for instance, on not clicking links on emails and all that. So that's also managing that side of things. On that side of it. In terms of good news on the insurance tender, we went out to tender. Obviously, it's a competitive market now with the amount of insurable risks increasing. Inflation is a big issue for us, natural disasters and the likes of that. But we managed to work with the insurance brokers and keep the new tender within the budget that we've got for that one. Again, it's evidence of the work the insurance team do with the council colleagues across the highways departments and all that we can prove we've got risk mitigation and good management controls in there. So that's, Jeremy, that's an overview of my finish.
And can I just ask paragraph 3.9 about without going into too many details, the highway tree that fell on somebody,
Yes.
and I can see it says the coroner's said.
Yeah, that's right.
Did you say, are there still ongoing claims, or does the fact the coroner said that mean?
That's a closed claim now. I think last time we reported it, the Health and Safety Commission had finished their review and said it was an accidental claim. The coroners also concluded the same, so the council, there's no fault at the council, so it was put down to accidental damage, so that was closed off in terms of any potential costs to the council.
So anybody affected, property or personal by that, needs to apply to their own insurance to.
Sorry, is that the case with fatality?
Well, yeah, but apart from the fatality, people were injured and there was damage to property.
Yes, that would fall into the same thing. There's no fault for the council. It would have been.
So they'll have to look to their own insurance and so on. Anybody else? Michael, Mr. Collins, Councillor Collins?
You could call it the wet one, I'm still dripping. This is one of those questions where I always think it's useful asking anyway, even though I know the answer. So if you look at Facebook and what have you, there are no punches that happen in Trafford without it being the council's fault and then knowing the exact pothole that caused the puncture. Everybody seems to know. I've had punches, I have no idea where they come from, but on Facebook, it seems everybody knows exactly where the puncture came from. Are we in a position to sort of repudiate that it's easy to make a claim against the council for that?
I think from the repudiation rates we've got our property 77% repudiation rate. So I think we've got a track record of demonstrating that. And I was speaking in the press today about repudiation rates of other councils higher than that. So there's potential to explore whether there's room for higher defence rates than what we have got. It's essentially up to 90% in terms of the whether it's highway injury, highway property. We'll have to look at more detail on, but I think it's in there that we've got a track record.
Good. So they're not an easy touch.
we can say we're not an easy touch anyway. The other question I had is on a similar theme. We've got a lot of mature trees in our particular ward, and people are always complaining about the damaged trees due to garden walls. Now, from a labour, I'm no brickie, but I look at the garden walls and think they've got no foundations. As soon as a root appears, there's going to be a problem with a garden wall. It's not necessarily, if we're going to chop down trees because roots grow, then I think I have a problem coming from the other side and the greening and what have you. Are we able to repudiate those claims, particularly to garden walls, rather than the actual structure of house?
I think it's a mixed bag. I think the circumstances do vary. I know there have been claims when we have the exception of responsibility because of certain reasons, but I think overall the repudiation rates are do demonstrate that we do have a good one. But I can do some more investigation and see what type of circumstances where we can defend, where we can't, because we're getting on information.
Yeah.
I think just on that, I think when I looked after insurance years ago, I think we did pay them out, but I think obviously our tree unit is quite heavily involved to understand what's caused the problem with the wall. Is it the tree? What's the remedy? And I suppose that betterment issue maybe is a consider. I think that's just one thing we probably just need to understand on this, is to where does betterment come in and what contribution might we want off those residents if there is a betterment case. I think that's the thing we just need to look at.
Councillor Walton?
I think there's some interesting information coming out of Wales after they adopted 20 miles an hour as a sort of a default for urban areas, and I think residents of Wales are getting £50 cheaper car insurance because of that policy decision. I'm just be interested to know, are there highways policies that we could adopt that could reduce our the cost of our insurance cover? Are we getting advice from our actuaries that are in that direction?
Off the top of my head, I don't know what I can say there. We'll see if there's anything that comes out from them. But so they actually do consider a lot of variables when they did their triennial assessment. So more likely would be the same as evidence in there from Wales that there is an impact on it. Then I can say this if there's anything in there.
Yeah, that would be great. I mean, I think we can possibly, if we reduce the speed of vehicles, then they strike potholes less forcefully. And certainly we should be able to argue that if a car was driving at 20 miles an hour, then that would be be less likely to damage itself. And similarly, in terms of crashes and collisions, they are likely to be less likely to happen, aren't they, at 20 miles an hour? And if we have a 20 mile an hour limit and people have been driving above it, then the responsibility is more on them, isn't it? So I'd certainly be interested to find out what their consideration of those things would be, and then perhaps we can feed that into the general policy mix for when we're considering these issues. Thank you.
Councillor Brophy?
I'm just on the section regarding cyber security. So we've had presentations here before about cyber security, but in the report it says the cost of cyber cover has increased significantly. However, cover tends to be limited and low limits imposed within received quotations, further restricting cover. Does that mean we're not properly covered for sort of cyber security incidents, or are we covered? I'm looking at page on the insurance report on 4.5. It's 4.5.
4.5, yeah. We're covered in the fact that we're self-insured in effect. So we've got the risk reserve, our risk reserve. So The cost of actual insurance quotes were nearly as much as we paid for the entire insurance for the period was covered for about 18 plus that 18 that side of things. So it was, I think it was the market is understanding the impact of potential risk, so that the premiums reflect that uncertainty. So over the last 4 or 5 years, we've approached the market. We have spoken down with cyber security experts and insurers to say that, and the conditions that we attach to that to say make sure you've got all your IT controls in place, and you set your firewalls and your risk management, and you sign up for the using your virtual private network key box. So we implement those anyway. So we're building onto this framework and the security around the ICT, the training as well. So we're actually, I suppose, we're managing that risk, knowing that we've got these controls in place. We're self-managing the fact that we would, if there was a significant issue, we'd cover it ourselves. I think we keep going back to the market to see whether what's the risk of a consequence of the financial impact versus the cost of the insurance premium. So up to now, it's been excessively expensive to think with the budget considerations to take into account. We'll manage that risk within our own environment, within our own resources. So, as I say, it's an evolving market which we keep going back and testing it, thinking, okay, value for money sounds a bit more realistic now to take it on. As I say, and then we can be sure that we're meeting the standards that they require from us to do that, to get the quote in terms of the controls.
I think just to add to that, I think, Mark, do we have on our work programme an update from the cyber team later on this year?
Yeah, either February or March meeting, Paul James is due to give an update on cyber security.
I think it's fair to say they've been quite a busy team, but I think where they've come from over the last couple of years in the fact that we've got quite a strong, small team. I think the systems they've developed and the protections we've got, I think the first thing is all well and good having a good insurance policy, but like you can't rest on your laurels, and I think it's what we're doing in terms of trying to move things so it's hosted on the cloud. Staff training is really, really important. So I think it's the ability to react, and I think that presentation again, I think is worthwhile. I think it was useful last year, but what they've done, the experiences they've developed, I think 2030 all touching wood, but I think we've moved forward quite a lot. And I think some of our suppliers of information, I'll just explain, like for example, the Department of Work and Pensions, how we use their systems, for example. They have compliance criteria that we can use as a checklist to make sure we're doing things right. The team's just done what they call a cyber assessment framework, which is a government framework from CLG. So we've been through that, and we've now come up with an action plan to further iterate and improve on the position we've got. So there's been quite a lot of positive movements in the last couple of years, but I think the exposure that we've still got, I think, and the prevalence of these things is not something we take for granted.
Thank you.
Indicate.
Yeah, I was just going to add to what Councillor Welch said about Vision Zero. That's going to probably have to do that as well. I just have to think about, I was just confused about these highway injuries and what they actually relate to. It's not just collisions, but it's like, I just wondered if you could give an example of what a highway injury would be. Is it just, it's not just because of potholes or other things?
Yeah, so there's highways injury, highways property, like damage to a car tyre. So the highways injury is where somebody would trip over, slip over, twist an ankle,
Right.
so and then they can't go to work, so man, I think that's their playing philosophy.
Can I just ask, what about people who have accidents tripping over things which are in the highway but not our property, belong to other public utilities and so on? Do we refer them to workers?
Yes, we do. It's referred on. suppose one of the, some of the issues we are trying to manage is unadopted highways where somebody makes a trip on it, looks like a council road, but it's not necessarily adopted. So, obviously that's an issue that we found quite easily. There are circumstances where we need to make sure that we've got a full register of all of our adopted highways. That's potentially small risk there. We were where it was adopted by the council, was the database might not be updated when we adopted. So it's a potential risk in that.
So we're not, yeah.
Yes.
There's a road in my ward, which is part of the adopted part, isn't it? So
Yeah.
the trip on the unadopted part should drag them into the. Sorry, Councillor Brooklyn.
Just a quick question on payments. It relates to a question I asked at full council last night. Some people are getting EV chargers that can't go into the payment, so you can charge from your own home electricity supply. Where does the council stand in terms of if people start putting those on pavement where the council owns the pavement, but obviously the resident owns that sort of channel that they put into the pavement?
It's a good question. I'll get back to you on that one. It's really interesting to see how that. But I'll get back to you.
Mr. Carter?
Thanks, Councillor Brophy. That's prompted me to ask a supplementary. I've seen residents, rather than dig a channel, use a flat rubber mat that raises slightly in weather. Disclosure, I'm not an expert, but it seems an eminently sensible thing. Is there a specification of that sort of solution that the council is happy to recommend? I think it pertains to the whole, if we're going to achieve our environmental targets, one of those might be encouraging EV usage unless people can charge from the home. It's a pipe dream.
Yeah, it's a good point. That's a good question. I'll follow that. It's something that's.
Mr. Wilson?
Just a comment on that is that, well, having seen been to the LGA conference recently, and there were lots of stalls with people with firms that are selling council solutions on that front, and there is actually a revenue opportunity there, because if you basically it would be the council that would put in a channel and a pavement that somebody can feed their cable through, and the idea is the resident would pay a fee to use that channel, and yearly, to be able to access it, and that presumably would cover any obviously hopefully give the council some money, but also cover any risk or liability.
I've got a supplementary, if that's all right. My understanding is that the way that's been described is that will be a bit like, at the moment, if people want to drop the curb on the driveway, that you have to have a council approved contractor to do that. So I suppose that will be a similar situation, wouldn't you? Need I suppose the question is how far are we on having the council approved EV power cable channels going into pavements? Because then hopefully it'd be nice if it was a revenue earner, wouldn't it? Because that would enable us to get to the net zero more quickly in Trafford, and also help Trafford finances maybe.
I think there's a report on that coming out soon. There's a lot of work. I think the council's doing a lot of work on that micro charging side of things at the moment. Not to answer, sorry, not to say
Michael Street, which is doing quite a bit of work in this area.
Yes, it certainly sounds better than having things on the pavement which are trip hazards, which put your claims up again. You have to sue the household.
It all depends how well it's set into the pavement. That's the thing, and what happens to it over time, because what is flush at first isn't necessarily flush 10 years down the line. That's the problem. So.
Okay, well, it's generated quite a lot of discussion about thanks very much. We move on to item 9, the budget monitoring report 24-25. Various things.
Yeah, I'll take that, Chair. Just by way of an overview, obviously this is our mid-year projection, so it's best projection of our council's budgeted position for the year that we took at the end of September. There's still a bit to go in terms of the rest of the year, but it's quite a comprehensive report, but I'll go through just some of the key bits. I think the part one of the report lists out quite a number of key tables just in summary form. So if I could just bring you to the table in section 1 on page 282, and then there's a bit more detail on page 283. This just shows what the projected outturn is for the current year at £3.6 million. I think the second table on 283 just highlights there quite a number of red items that obviously we've reported in the past that are contributing to that position. So we still see continued pressure on children's placements. Adults, social care, demand pressures we are seeing coming through again. Still, I think that the one that's probably caught us a little bit is the cost of temporary accommodation. So housing people who are homeless. And I think what we saw when we set the budget for 24/5 was that there was quite a surge in the number of people presenting towards the back end of 23/4, so there's quite an uplift. We're now seeing the full year impact of that. Obviously, this is something that most authorities see. I think traffic exposure at the moment is difficult for us in budget terms, but I think other authorities are more exposed than traffic, but this is still, it's not a good news item. Just part way down the table, I think a concern I've got is that when we set budgets, invariably we need to identify a savings programme. And what we're seeing this year is that there's just over £1 million of our savings programme for 24/5. At this point, I think we're not going to be able to deliver. We know the implications of that, and we know why authorities across the country are failing, and it's the fact that they're setting unrealistic budgets, unrealistic savings programmes that they can't deliver. Part of the SIPFA review that we had, the data that we'd already compiled for them was to tell them what our performance on savings was in previous years, which has been really positive, I think. But I think this year's the one to watch, and I think through financing change and CLT, that's something we've been really keen on in doing exception reporting. What's contributed to that? What can we do? How can we mitigate that position? But I think it's just one to watch, and it's one to be mindful of, that these programmes don't unravel for us because we can't afford for that to happen. I think just in terms of that position, question is, so what are we doing about it? And my view has been to CLT and to the executive is that we need to get to year end, and we need to mitigate that as much as we can. Because what happens if we've got an overspend at year end is we have to pay for that by using reserves, and that will be an unplanned use of reserves. And when we've tried to explain to the committee and executives in the past, our levels of reserves in traffic are quite low. What we don't want to do is use them in an unplanned way, because again, that will be a slippery slope to go on for an authority. So we've got a real focus through the corporate leadership team, through financing change, to look at how we can mitigate that in year position to make sure we don't call on reserves. I think just in terms of explaining very briefly the movement from period 4, when we presented the projected outturn, at that point that was £4.2 million. So actually you think, well, we've gone better. What's happened between period 4 and period 6 is that we'd already looked at what we could mitigate at that period 4 position. And actually, we bought mitigations in of £1 million. So really, you think the overspend should have come down by £1 million. It's that underlying pressure that we still see on children's placements and adults predominantly. So in terms of an overall budget position for us now, I'm just trying to keep everybody focused, because we're not just looking at 25/6 and balancing 25/6. We need to get out to 24/5 in a balanced position. So we're looking over a shoulder at the same time as looking forward. I think just some headlines for the rest of the report. I think I'll just talk about the dedicated schools grant budget and the schools budgets. And if I just refer you to page number 291, the schools budgets, and particularly the high needs budgets, so the budgets that we cover the cost of special schools and out of borough placements, we're forecasting massive pressures in that budget area. So at year end, we're projecting in this monitor that we think that deficit position on that area of the budget will be about £20 million. Fortunately, at this stage, government's saying to us, account for that totally separately from the rest of your budget, which we are doing. But I think the soundings I keep and the lobbying I keep making to government is that how can it be ring-fenced when I'm using up to £20 million of money that should be sat in our bank account covering other reserves that we've got? So that means we're getting less investment income through Treasury that Frank explained. We'd have even more benefit through that had we got that £20 million more. So whilst it's ring-fenced, there are things that's actually mean it's not ring-fenced anymore, because we're seeing that pressure coming through. We keep pressing government to allow us to do something about that. Just skirting back to page number 289, just an update on the capital programme. The projected spend on the capital programme this year is just short of £70 million. What we're looking at doing at the moment is, the capital programmes are difficult because some of the schemes are quite lumpy, and delivery can sometimes be difficult in terms of predicting that with 100% accuracy. I think what we're just trying to do is make sure we align our budget with the resources that we've got to spend on capital. Some of them are capital receipts, and it is quite difficult to sell land again in a timely fashion to generate the receipts we need to pay for the budget. So I think we're just making reference in the report to make sure there's a bit of an alignment to make sure the budget is aligned with the resources we've got, and particularly the timing of those resources. So it's just another exercise that we'll do in the run up to setting the budgets for 25/6 and beyond. So happy to take any questions if anybody's got any, Chair.
Thanks. Can I just first say, Councillor G submitted 4 questions on this budget thing. Rather than my reading them all out, can we agree that we put them into the minutes of the meeting and then refer them to officers, because they're quite detailed things about them. I don't think anybody, well, probably you could, but I'd be amazed if you could answer them all in detail now. So if we do that, then Councillor Z get his answers, and we'll all see the answers because we'll come by the officers.
Yeah, on that particular point, you don't really want a situation where councillors don't bother to come and just submit questions, otherwise
Well,
we don't get the discussion.
that raises another matter really, because I mean, when you say don't bother to come, I don't know why. You know, it might have personal reasons for that.
Yeah,
But we were discussing before whether to get around situations like, or help with situations like this, whether members, including Jeannie, not the officers, but whether we'd have some sort of pre-meeting where we can all talk about these things. If people want to format questions, then they can do, and we can get them to the officers before. It'd have to be once the agenda's out. We could get the questions to officers so they could get an answer at the meeting rather than us just saying we referred it back. And then it gives them a chance for people who perhaps I'm not noticing it in this committee, but people might be a bit shy about asking questions, and you know, the new members and so on. So it would give a chance for us to inform it, but perhaps by teams rather than meet again. But we did it by teams. I don't know, Jenny, whether you've got teams, or we could resort to Zoom, I suppose, and do that. But whether we did something like that, and then people could have an informal, they could submit questions or ask things, and then we could submit them to the officers, and then they could come back with the proper answers at the committee meeting, rather than, you know, if you ask a complicated question here, it may be able to answer, but really I think it's fair to the officers to have a chance to look at it. So what do members think about that? Is it something we'd like to do or not? Councillor Walton?
I think that's a really interesting discussion, but it might be for the council to consider at a higher level, particularly given that the government has just changed its policy on whether councils can hold you know, hybrid meetings and or online meetings. So given that there's probably going to be a discussion and a review of that, then maybe we could feed into that rather than making a decision for ourselves, given that whatever we do here probably needs to be replicated in other committees.
Sorry, Jim.
It's scrutiny committees, and the scrutiny committee are having a pre-meeting by to ask questions, and it's recommended because actually every question I've asked, you've always come back to me, but that's not minuted. It's not in the minutes. So I think personally, it gives people a chance to ask questions, and some of them are complex. And today we've got to come back with questions. So if we can get to the officers first, then at least we've got some chance of discussing it. It doesn't stop any further question, but I just think I said about a hybrid. I said about meeting on Teams, because otherwise you're going to have to come back into the council for a pre-meeting. I don't think that you need to do that. And as I said, I think the General Scrutiny Committee are doing it, and also I think Health Scrutiny is doing that as well.
If it's good enough for them, then it should be good enough for us.
Oh, yeah. And it's recommended by the Central Public Scrutiny, because I was in training.
Just to come, I think as well, we can't have the officers here, because then it would be a formal meeting. We'd have to go through all the legal thing about, you know, telling the public. I think if it's just the members and the members of the committee, then it's an informal meeting, and we don't have to, you know, it's not something the public could come into or anything. So I think, well, I'm looking at Stephanie to ask opinions about it. I think we should push past the issue as well. But I think, you know, to avoid, if we had the officers here, it would be just another meeting. We'd have to go through all the advertising and so on. But I think if we just ourselves, then we can probably avoid that. But sorry, Councillor Atkinson was going to ask.
Yeah, as I say, we do it in scrutiny on Teams, and it's usually 3 days before the meeting. I mean, it does mean that we have to have the papers well in advance, because if some of our, I mean, I'm not working, but I know I looked at the papers today, and we'd have to kind of manage our time better, wouldn't we, to make sure, because there's so many. I mean, there's over 400 pages of this one, isn't there? So it is slightly different from scrutiny. That scrutiny, I think, that one of the biggest aims of scrutiny pre-meetings is more to, because with other kinds of scrutiny, you're more likely to make recommendations, but we're not really doing that. We're just kind of being very critical, aren't we, and just keeping a really, really good eye on what's going on and stuff, and asking information questions. So I think it's a really good idea that we could give you notice about getting more detailed answers. So yeah, let's give it a try, but we need to be careful with the time to make sure you get the papers in advance.
Okay, are you happy then if we look at that and then come forward, you know, by email to circulate to members to see what, not everybody see, Councillor G's not here, for example, so we could circulate to see what people think about it and how we could do it, and we'll check with legal about, you know, I mean, I'm sure it is okay, but we'll check with them that it's okay to do it like that, and we're not crossing any legal problems. And I think officers, well, I think you can't be there, because I think it would be a legal thing if you did that. But I'm not sure what happens to scrutiny. Do our officers there scrutiny? No, definitely, yeah. So we'll have a look at that and come back to members.
Yeah, Anthony, I mean, I'm also thinking of kind of maybe some training as well, because, you know, some of the stuff I just still don't understand.
Yeah.
And so it'd be really helpful to be able to ask people what it all means or how.
Yeah, I think that's a critical part of it, that people can ask things without feeling in a public forum and everybody is watching it. You know, I mean, I've lost count of the number of training things I went to, and I still wouldn't say I understand it all anyway. So, but I think, you know, certainly for new members, it's useful to have an informal forum where we can all talk to one another, and then, like we said, if people want to ask questions, we can formulate them. I can pass them on to the officers, and they can come to a proper answer, or they can distribute it, or come bring it to the committee. So we'll look at that, and I'll get back to you about. We'll get back to you about that. Okay.
Just going to say, I mean, I'm definitely thinking, although I read them off, when I come here and hear you speak, that brings out more questions anyway.
Yeah.
So there'll always be more questions.
Yeah. Oh yes, it's not. We're not saying that the meeting's just going to be, but we've all discussed this, so that's the end of it. I do.
The other thing is the relationship with scrutiny that the audit committee should have as well. Because whilst we can look at the overall ask questions, etc., it's actually scrutiny. You should be looking at things like value for money as well, because they can do the work on that. So, for example, the last time we had something about public health, but really we should be aware of it because it's actually in the report, but it's scrutiny can do that value for money, or do some work that can help in the process.
So Wilson?
Yes, on possibly moving on from that, and in terms of the report that we've just had and the discussion about or the mention of the cost of temporary accommodation. I'm just wondering, and this is kind of preempting the discussion of the work programme later on. But we've had reports on the cost of children's placements and things like that. And I'm wondering if at this point it would be good to have a detailed report from somebody on, you know, breaking down what the costs of temporary accommodation are and what's feeding into it and what potential solutions are for a future meeting. Is that something that we could consider?
I think that's a good idea, because I'm aware that we are close to using some hotels, for example, and I don't like bed and breakfast, but obviously I was a bit surprised when I saw the amount in the papers for that.
I think
Yeah, and I was going to say, I know one of my questions would be, I would like to know much more about how possible it is to like you said, to looking at leasing and looking at borrowing money to buy a house. That house would be really interesting to see what you can actually do.
I think through executive and the work with corporate leadership team, we really focused, I think, on what can we do. You may recall there was the property on Church Road in Urmston that we looked to acquire to convert into temporary accommodation. There are others being looked at, and I think we do have reports, and I'll take that back for one of Richard's team to maybe we can build something into the work plan. But I think, in a nutshell, if we put somebody in bed and breakfast accommodation, those rates are about £85 a night, £525, I think the maths works out a week. The claim then goes in for housing benefits, the housing benefit, and the housing benefit maximum claim is based on some historic rental from 2011 where we get £113. So for every one person, that's £400 per week. What's that? £20,000 a year. But then that bed and breakfast accommodation is not suitable for any length of time that's above a few weeks. So you've got threats of judicial review. So what do you do about that? And actually remaining other accommodation, and that presses that cost pressure even more. So I know we with Richard's team we're looking as often as we can at what opportunities we've got to apply more accommodation just to take the heat out of that budget pressure. But we can certainly have a look as to how we can get that into the work plan, Mark, can't we?
Thanks. Is somebody else that can take down, councillor Council?
Thanks. I've got 2 or 3 questions, the biggest of which I'm struggling to formulate into a question, and I'm also very conscious it's in the area of children's services, so I know something of which I speak, and I need to avoid getting told off on it. In the last 2 months, from period 4 to 6, the deterioration in the forecast for children's services, driven by children's placements, is 1.35 million. A significant sum it's not. I don't recall ever seeing a variance drop, a decline in forecast outturn of that size occurring over a 9-week period. So it's of substance and import. So if the last 6 months of the year that was repeated, that'd be another 5 million quid adverse to budget just on children's placements. So I'm not entirely certain what the question that this committee ought to be asking you is around that, but it strikes me that as an accounting audit committee to see an adverse move in year-end forecast of 1.35 million in a period of 9 weeks is dramatic and worthy of some consideration. I know the explanations around due to new placements, increasing complexity, delays and step downs. I don't know if there's any reassurance that can be given to say that, and they're one-offs and we fully anticipate that's an irregularity that won't be repeated. But if it's suddenly a really complex child that comes on the books, it wasn't on the books, it's going to cost us £500,000 quid, that could happen every month. Then what I shouldn't be asking you what question we should be asking, but I think there's an accounting audit committee needs to understand the dynamics of that. So I'll stop talking for a second. Sorry, just additionally, and I haven't memorised the risk register. If this isn't a specific risk on the risk register, should it be?
I think just in terms of the children's position, I think it is a big variation period on period. And it's not massive numbers that contribute to that. I think in terms of risk, there's nothing, you can't say it's not a big risk, it is a massive risk. We've got the scrutiny sessions coming up over the next, there's 2 more scrutiny sessions on the budget next Monday. I think it's a social care one. This might be a relevant question for Jill, just to understand what's happening in that respect. I think we monitor monthly on demand-led budgets, so we saw a big increase period 4 to 6. What have we seen 6 to 7? The numbers I've seen from 6 to 7, small increase, nowhere near that figure. And I think there is something about how we manage the budget for the rest of the year. What's the contingency in the budget that we're still reporting the fact we've still got buffer within this position of £300,000 for children. So there may be new pressure. To what extent, as we get nearer the end of the year, we don't need as much contingency. So is the contingency enough? I think that's the management of that position. But what we're really mindful of is going into planning for 25-26. What budget do we put into children's services for 25-26? We've got to be really cognizant of what's happening here. And when we set budget in February, what information have we got? So I know we've got P6, the P8 position for November will get reported in January. So we need to be as informed as possible to make sure the budget is as robust as we can. If you look at the wind down home to school transport, you probably heard me say previous years, one of the reasons we're overspending is home to school transport. measures are in place to try to balance the costs and do things cheaper and look at routes and everything else, but we got the budget right in for 24/5, so we recognise the growth, we've reflected that in budgets, and at the moment, we're projecting a saving of 95,000 in this, so I think it's difficult, and I'll take that back to Jill as to what we do around projecting those numbers, but I think the volatility suggests it's quite difficult.
I should have started off with the context of it is in absolutely no way any criticism or questioning of the capability or judgment of the any officers and the leadership involved. I think just having a quick look through the figures, it seems like almost the whole of the rest of the council between period 4 and 6 have made progress versus the previous forecast, but it's swamped with the demand-led budget around children. So that's not a question, that's just a contextualisation.
And I think just on that, when you look at the adults budget, children's budget is 60% of our net revenue budget.
Yeah.
So changes there, but just on your question about the strategic risk register, I don't think we've got anything specific on children's demand, but obviously that part of the financial management risk. And you'll see when we get onto the strategic risk register, we're at a point in the year now, we try to keep the risk score on the financial management risk quite dynamic. But at the moment, we're in a position now where we're overspending in the year, but trying to manage that position while still setting balanced budget proposals for 25/6. And when we put the draft budget report to executive in October, there was still a £10 million gap. So it is the risk around finance, I think, needed elevating. I think the justification to say, well, it's not 25, it is. I think it's the highest risk we've probably got as a council, is balancing the budget, but to keep it 25 all the time, I think will probably take the emphasis away. We've got to a point now where it's really critical that we get a balanced budget. We've got to do that looking over the shoulder here and looking forward as well.
Thanks, and if it had been moved up to 25, I think we'd have been asking why. I think us and all members having a sense of there's red lights flashing, there's fire bells going, and it's the number one focus of management leadership every week to address that situation. I think it's what we're saying and seeing definitely what we want to see. If I have 2 further questions, please, Chair.
Sorry, Chair. Yes.
Thank you. I'll ask them both and give you a chance to. I'll ask the difficult one first, give you a chance to think about it. So there's a £3.56 million overspend forecast. Here it sits out to what do you think the probability is there to recover this in the year to go? And the second question is massively more detailed than we released today. I'm quoting here from somewhere in the paper. In April 2024, the 100% premium charge on long-term empty homes was reduced from 2 years to 1 year. I think that means if I own an empty home, for the first 2 years I pay extra council tax, and now I'm only, in future I'm going to have to pay for 1 year if I was a new person entering that situation. So I'm just checking, do I understand that, and why was that basically a discount given to people?
Just on that particular point, that meant a property that was empty. Properties that are empty attract council tax premiums, and I think what government did in 24/5 was reduce the period that property had to be empty before a premium was charged.
All right, so the premium charge on it was reduced from 2 years to 1 year. I think not very clearly worded, but it might be the government's problem. And if I ask a supplementary, I think, and it might be my memory playing tricks, that we, as a council, recently said we were going to charge second home owners in Trafford more council tax. Has that been implemented, and is that generating?
So these additional premiums at the time we were charged, it was staggered. So in 24/25, these premiums, and and bringing the premium in sooner. Again, it was a national measure, but that was effective from April 24. Second property premium, that again will come in, is effective from April 25.
Thanks, that'll be in the next year's budget.
That we're accommodating that in our budget planning now, yeah. But thanks for that, council. I think just on the first point, how do we recover 3.56?
Or what the probability is, if there's zero probability, but just
I
understand that it's
no, there isn't. I think one of the things we've been looking at is that these figures are our budget holders' figures, that we support our budget holders in coming up with their projections on their budgets. I think one of the things we've looked at is in previous years what's happened between period 6 and period 12 in terms of one big thing that gives us an understanding, and I know we've talked about it at this committee before, is savings on staffing budgets. So if we've got a vacancy and we speak to a budget holder, we'll ask them, what's your realistic view as to filling the vacancy, and that gets included in the budget projection. If we don't fill that vacancy in time, the saving on staffing invariably goes up. So we've seen that between period 6 and period 12, the amount of staffing underspend has generally increased. Will we see that again? That's something we're going to have to watch. And we do have some controls on our recruitment for some back office roles where we try to pause recruitment for a couple of months. I think within these figures we've also got contingencies, so across all areas we've got probably just over approaching 1.3 million of contingencies. So as we said, we've still got some in children's, there might be new demand that takes that up. Some in adults, and we've got a general contingency. So we've got about 1.3 million of contingency. There's other things that happen that we can't necessarily predict. What will the airport business plan look like, and will we get an exceptional dividend like we got at the end of 23-24? Can't predict that because we don't necessarily know, but indications are the airport's performing quite well, so there's potential for that, but I don't want to guess what that might be. Can we bring forward savings that are in the budget plans for 25-6 potentially? Are other things we can look at? We do work as well with a combined authority. Combined authority from time to time look at things like the waste budget, transport budget, looking at their reserves positions. Is there anything we can give districts back? Because as treasurers, combined authorities, treasurers sick of us saying we're skint all the time and what can you do to help us? So we may get some refund, repayment of reserves that they've accumulated. So there is potential, but I think through finance and change, we're looking at coming back to finance and change in December with what we're going to do about 3.6, because I don't want to use any sort of reserve to anywhere near that level to balance it. So there's a real focus on it. It could be umpteen measures. So I think we won't gamble on the balancing, but we will certainly make inroads to it. But that's subject to demand as well.
Yeah, I've got 3 questions. The first you kind of a little bit asked is about contingency budgets, because they seem to be appearing a lot around the trains that seem a bit dangerous. And I wanted to know that I don't really understand them and how that fits in with reserves. That was the first one. The second one was about public health. Do I understand that that they're getting funding and they're supposed to be having no reduction, I don't think, in public health. It's just really important, I think, that they get what they should pay. But the long-term impacts of not having that money is a disaster sometimes. The other question was about County Relief Road, about financial risk, because you've written something, you said options are being assessed around the delivery of the rationalisation element of the scheme. I wondered what that was, and wondered what financial risks there still are around the road.
Thanks. I think Karen Dockett and in reverse order. Carrington Relief Road, I think, is obviously we've looked at design work, we've looked at, what's that term we use there, rationalisation works. We do get funding from, I think we've had funding from Homes England, from GMCA, I think around what they call macro growth funding and things like that to do the works we've done. It is a risk because it's our, at the end of the day, this scheme will be a massive scheme and the scheme's not in our budget. I don't know the means of how we would finance that at the moment. I think that's the risk around it all. I think what the expenditure we incur at the moment, the grants that we're using to fund that expenditure are non-repayable if the scheme doesn't go forward. But I think it's just obviously working on what that financing solution is. That's the risk as to how we're going to actually bridge what is a massive scheme. Public health, I think, yes, we spend what the government allocate to Trafford. So we've not diluted that public health budget in this report, and I think the contingency budget position is, when we set the budget at the start of the year, £218 million, to be a bit remiss not to set elements of buffer. So we have a council-wide one that, in effect, midday control as much as we can corporately, but we have contingency buffers in demand-led service areas for the reasons we've talked about, because we can't accurately project that demand. The difference, so those are proper budgets. If we don't spend them, that helps us in terms of our outturn position. So we'll always maintain a contingency budget and make sure it's adequate when we set the budget. Reserves are just cash held on the balance sheet, not part of the budget, but needed to cover risks. We talked about insurance claims tonight. That's one area, but there are others. So they're held separately just to cover them. And we have a budget support reserve that we're helping our budget planning and setting the budget.
Okay, anybody else? Councillor Gordon.
I thought Councillor Carter opened up a rich scene there going into the end of this year and the start of the next year. Because I think one of the sort of consistencies that we've had in Trafford over as long as I've been involved is that we do, to a certain extent, tend to recover in the final quarter of the year. First quarter of the next year, it sort of goes upside down, and some of it is filling those vacancies. But if the budget for the next year should reflect the staffing we need, it shouldn't really jump up, and yet it does. So I think some spending is being delayed. It's always the habit of cost centre owners and what have you to delay something. Everybody wants to come in straight, but it's a problem for budget planning every year that over the summer we usually find that we've already got a deficit for the year. And I'm just wondering how we can avoid that. There was something else I wanted to raise. I wanted to praise you because the actual homeschool transport, you made it as a matter of fact point that you've got it right. This is the first time in living memory I can think that home to school transport in November isn't running away as a huge expense. So I think it deserves a little bit more acknowledgement of that than we were giving you. You spoke it as though it's a matter of fact. I thought, flipping out. Anyway, it's that transition from savings in 1 year moved into the next year.
I think it's really difficult. I know from my perspective, if things right themselves, it annoys me. It's great financially, but I want to make sure we got that reputation piece right. it's no good coming up with a balanced position. I think we're at period 6 now. The underlying position, I think, is getting gradually worse. I said I talked about £1 million of mitigations that we had from period 4. So that figure should have come down. The underlying pressure is going up at the moment. Budget holders naturally at the start of the year are pessimistic. I think we find that. So budget reports at the start of the year tend to project the worst. But it's setting a budget where you draw the line as to how much we take account of what's happened in the past and where we've seen underspends of running cost staffing. We try to reflect that in the budget plan through putting in vacancy factors and what, but it's just not a precise science, is it?
Okay, thanks very much. Anybody else? No? We're going to item 10, the risk register, which Mark will deal with. You'll see there's been changes in the red, green and amber part of it.
So yeah, the latest version of the strategic risk register. It's based on information collated from officers around the end of October into early November. So there's updates on each of the risks. Just to draw attention to the changes in risk scores, and we've already mentioned risk 1, the main finance risk, increasing from 20 to 25. And there is reference to those issues talked about in terms of children's placements and accommodation in that update. Going the other way, risk 5, which covers more information governance, data security, shows a reduction in the risk score from a high 20 to a medium 15. And that's really, I think, reflecting progress in the team, fully staffed and had a redesign. And I think in the stats they showed some improvements in some of the performance reports in there. So I think that score really decreased on the back of that. The risk register whole as well has had a refresh in terms of the new corporate priorities, so make sure they're reflected there where appropriate as well. Been discussed in terms of having some specific updates on risks through the committee year. So I think in the work programme we do have the cyber security on February, and provisionally as well we've got the climate change one in March. So I think then through into the 25-6 programme we will continue to look at being able to drill down a bit more on individual risk areas. So there will continue to be a further update in the final quarter on the risk register, but happy to take any questions to follow up.
Thanks, Mark. Any questions? Mr. Walton?
Yes, just regarding the cyber or the information security. I know that we've had a couple of cyber incidents recently where attacks on the council. I'm just wondering if that's factored into this report or whether that's this report was done before we had those incidents.
I'll have to check that. It's possible they just after the update. As I say, there'll be a specific update on this risk anyway at the meeting.
Anybody else? Mr. Carter?
Interestingly, because I thought if you were saying about the risk going to 25, but actually if you have got a risk register, you should also have a period where you think you may be okay. Because as you say, if you have a high risk, you just get used to it. You actually need to have something to say that we would like to reduce, or we would like to reduce it, and I understand the difficulties. But if you just keep it, it will be there forever, by the looks of it. And it shouldn't be, should it?
I think the cycle on that generally is we will relax the score a little bit. Come February, if we've got balanced budget proposals, we know the year's going okay, you probably think at that point slacken off on that score a little bit.
I seem to remember that's what happened a few months ago, didn't it? It went down because there was a balanced budget and it's coming back up.
I think out of all the risks, the one that's changed scores the most over time for those risks that have been in there quite a while.
Okay, so I've forgotten who else put that. There's Councillor Catterson, because then Councillor Murphy.
Could I address 3 risks, please? Not surprisingly, the first is risk 1. Really encouraging to see the active engagement with SIPFA. It talks in the future things we could do about introducing some of the, or learning from some of SIPFA's benchmarked potential savings routes, if you know where I'm at. I don't think it says what any of them are. Is there any way that we could hear what the potential savings that SIPFA benchmarked in other councils are that could possibly relate to what's stated there in risk 1?
I think at this point, I suppose it's policy to some degree until we draft a final budget. I think it's fair to say though that this budget planning exercise, we looked at obviously the stuff that SIPFA have identified, those measures. We looked at what measures authorities that had issued section 114s, what were they doing in their savings programmes like Birmingham. And we looked at those authorities who had applied for exceptional financial support. I think across the board, I think the view was that there was some, but not material ones to help us given the size of the gap we've got. Some of the SIPFA ones, I think the view back was there's potential to go a little bit further and investigate, but I think overall they're not overly material. There's nothing new jumping out thinking, crikey, that's something we missed.
Okay, no golden egg at the end of the rainbow then. On risk 7, as we've seen this over the years, this is the risk around places sufficiency. There's been kind of, the risk has been framed very much in the direction of, we've got a great educational offer, we've got a lot of demand, have we got sufficiency of spaces? And a really recent phenomenon emerging in the reception and year 1 primary schools is quite the reverse. There's been quite a dramatic, I think 5% in 1 year, change in demand and anticipation that that's not a blip and could continue. So I guess the questions around the framing of the risk. Do we need to add an element into that risk that's specifically about what are the implications if we have a protracted long-term drop in demand for stability and viability of primaries?
Yeah, I think I know this was it in the red category, this risk at one point, and then things have changed a little over the last year or two, so that would be fair enough to look at that side of it within the updates. Yeah.
Thank you. And forgive me, as I say, I haven't memorised the overall loan risk, but one of the big things that's happened, that's my elbow squeaking, in the last few months has been the unanticipated departure of a director of service, and that role being temporarily backfilled by an already fully occupied director of service. So forgive me if that's already captured, but is that something that we should include on the risk register, because you can only stretch leadership resource a certain distance, and there are service and financial challenges to be addressed in both those directions.
Yeah, no, it's not, as far as the way explicitly covered in that update, although I know the Director of Children's Services has provided both updates for children's and adults, but I think it's something as well for CLT to consider, and to bear in mind for future updates, but it's not actually at the moment specifically being raised.
Really good, thanks.
I think just to add to that, I think obviously there's one around business continuity that links to that a little bit, but what we discussed at CLT, and I've spoken to Mark subsequently, is that on a regular basis we look at what other districts are doing, what are on their risk registers, what do we understand by becoming risks that we've got. Succession as a key one, isn't it? And I think we'd said we'd have a risk workshop with a view to making sure that we keep this fresh. So I think that would be part of those considerations then going forward.
Well, who's next? So Councillor Brooke is next. And then
Yes, some of the ones I was going to ask about just been covered, so I won't ask that. I'm just looking at the children's one, and it just kind of builds on the one we just heard, that schools and new buildings take quite a long time in planning. Have we got in there the risks that we've got for the increased housing that we're going to have in Trafford? So I know, thinking about the Simply Wedge development, we've got a primary school included in the plans there, but there's no plan for a secondary school. Yet the secondary schools in South Borough are particularly stretched. I know this is long term and might be outside the scope of the time frame you're looking at, but how do plans and risks get built in terms of, you know, that big development there in terms of pressures on school places, particularly, well, both primary and secondary school places?
I think I know, I'm not part of the group, but I know Richard Rowe and Claire Fisher from the schools team, they look at place demand projections to have a look at the sufficiency of that estate. I think it's something I can take back to see how we're reflecting that in the plans, but I know there are considerations that are made, certainly.
No, as well, we had I think about a year or so ago, an update to the committee on this particular risk around school places. There's a lot of intelligence they use, different sources when they're building in the forecasts each year.
Thank you. The second one I was going to ask was, it was mentioned earlier on about the risks with children's provision, the out of borough and those specialist placements that are needed, the high complex needs. Is that included in the first risk, which is the highest one, or is that included in the schools risk? Where does that one actually sit?
No, there is reference, no finance have added reference to that in the main, the first risk, risk one, to the pressures from placements in the October update.
And is that
it's on
why?
page 349, there's some reference to that.
Yeah, I'm looking at that risk one. Is that why is that the contributing factor for the increase in score? Because that's now gone up, hasn't it? It's now 25, the highest it can be. Is that because of what we were discussing earlier regarding children's?
Yeah, I think it is one of them. I think obviously the proximity to the need to set a balanced budget, probably the key driver. Obviously the growing high needs deficit going up to £20 million is not something we can ignore either. So I think it's a combination of factors.
Councillor Baskerville.
Move the other one down. Yeah, thank you. It was actually just perfect following on from that. And we've spoken about it quite a bit this evening. So the deficit dedicated schools grant 20 million 24-25 up to as high as 44 million 28-29. As has been referenced, obviously that all is kind of brought together in number one with that risk going up. As already been discussed as well, you know, it doesn't sit on the budget, but there are implications, i.e. you can't have additional income. Some of the councils are really impacted, are actually paying a huge amount of interest even on that. so almost as a, not in reality, but as a thought process, if you were able to take that out, would number one have increased to 25, or would it be at 20?
I think we would say we're putting it to 25 even if we didn't have that position. That'd be my take on that. And again, going back to that comment about we need to set a balanced budget, and the draft budget was still £10 million a trip.
Thank you. I presume that'll be the answer. Again, so we keep talking about it, and it's mostly referenced in one and not in the education travel vision. So, as has been said, can we see that as its own risk factor in future, or how would that go down?
For the high needs in the DSG position, I think it's a consideration. Yeah, like I said, we will take stock as to whether or not these are the appropriate ones and whether or not they're specific enough, because there's some big ticket items hidden within some of the risks we've got now. We might want to bring them out. I think it's just something we'll have to consider.
Thanks.
Okay, anybody else? Can I just say, the school numbers, because I've been here a long time, but there's a sort of long cycle, I think, which, you get houses, you get young couples coming in, 2 or 3 years later they have kids and they're at school, and the kids grow up and leave home, go to university, and you go through this cycle. It might be a cycle of about 20 years, but there is a sort of base cycle to this, I think, based on demographics, because we're always getting this, we've been here long enough, we've not got enough school places, a few years later we've got too many, and we're closing down schools, and then we're worrying about why we're closing down. So it's not an easy problem to tackle, I think. Okay, can we go on to the next one, which is the number 11, the audit and assurance service update. If you see Matt, thank you.
Yes, an update on internal audit work carried out between July and September. So the focus, there was a number of final reports issued across a range of different service areas, and also some work around particular grant claims. We did some checks of that were required to as part of the sign-off process, and also some follow-up work. Section 4 of the report, page 386, just refers to the numbers in terms of there were 5 final reports issued during the period, one draft, as well as 2 other pieces of work around grant claims. The table in section 5 then sets out what the individual pieces of audit work were. And also you see, in terms of the opinion levels, going back to our 4 opinion levels we have, they were all either the highest or the second highest opinion. So there was one substantial opinion, the highest one, and the others were reasonable opinions. So the work in the period we covered with our partners from Salford, did a piece of work around the IT service desk and the service management processes. There were also reviews within adult services looking at processes around the direct payments and follow-up of previous work. Also reviewing catering services and a couple of schools, and also some work around care leaver payments, the processes there. And then in terms of the grants work, that was around the disabled facilities grant, which we're required to do every year in terms of audit input to that. And then there was another one came up around pothole fund, where we're required to provide assurance to GMCA, who manage that. So the table there, that summarises the various pieces of work. Each of those cases, there were action plans for all those where opinion levels have been given, and each recommendation within that action plan, there is agreed responsibilities, and all those recommendations have been accepted within those reports, so they're all subject to following up into the 6 to 12 months. And then just the next part of the report just summarises their other areas of activity. So work around the strategic risk register that we've already covered. There's work around the National Fraud Initiative. The main part of the exercise is every 2 years. Well, we've just come to the start of a new one, the 24/5 exercise. So a whole range of data has been submitted to the Cabinet Office, so we've liaised with lots of different services across the council to make sure that data has been submitted. So there'll be a series of data matches coming out in the next month or two for investigation, and the likes of the council team will be involved in investigating those, as well as a number of different services. So I'll provide a little bit of an update on that in the next update report. Just going in terms of section 7, the impact of the work, as I mentioned, in terms of the recommendations, they've all been accepted in Q2, and the reports have been issued. Make reference to a couple of follow-up updates there. Corporate health and safety audit we've done the year before, also Broadheath Primary. So all the recommendations from those 2 reviews have been implemented since they were made. Just in terms of overall progress against the plan, you've got Appendix 1 on page 391 that summarises the different planned work. In terms of a target, we had targeted 6 reports in Q2, which we achieved, and we've got similar planned targets for Q3 and Q4, so I can obviously update on those as we go through the rest of the year. There's a number of new pieces of work started in recent weeks, so there'll be further liaison with different services to agree on work that we do in the final quarter of the year. In section 9, just to summarise some upcoming work and reports work that will come out fairly shortly. For instance, there's work at the moment around budgetary control, building control, and also housing standards. So we expect within the Q3 update to begin in some updates around those. And also, as I say, the NFI work, we'll be reporting on progress around that. It's also worth noting, I think I've mentioned before, around the changes in internal audit standards. There's currently a consultation by CIPFA in applying, there's been global audit standard changes that CIPFA are now making sure for the UK public sector that they're properly applied, so there's a consultation out. Any changes will come into effect from the 1st of April 25. Feedback we've had up to now is there shouldn't be anything, if you've gone through the old standards, there shouldn't be anything significantly new with the refreshed, the new ones, but there's clearly areas we'll need to look at, things like our reporting and whether we need to update our internal audit charter and strategy and the like to reflect any of those changes. So again, I'll update further as we go along over the next few months on that. And so at the February meeting, I'll give you an October to December update on the work we've done there.
Okay, any comments, questions? Mr. Carter?
Just a really quick one. You've got a list of schools that are going to, in Q4, be audited. Do they know in advance that they're going to be audited, or?
Yeah, the ones that I put in a public report, I've made sure we have actually made sure they're not going to see it just looking at that.
I could be a bit of a shock to someone if we didn't do that. Okay, is that thank you, that one? Thank you very much. So on to work programme, item 12.
Okay, so yeah, in terms of the work programme, there has been some movement on it over the coming months, as we particularly changes around the audit of the accounts. But you'll see, as I mentioned earlier, we'll have due to have a cyber security update at the next meeting. Also, the treasury management strategy due to come. I believe that I think there'll be some training linked to that outside of the meeting that will be arranged. And obviously external audit will give a further update around current work around 2024. So I think all the items as they currently stand there are listed in that report for February and March meetings.
Okay, just roughly.
Just on that plan, we looked at the risks with the complex needs services,
Is that something that is going to be put on the plan for future report to this committee? Because we've highlighted how that risk has gone up and the reasons and all the discussions that we've had. Is that going to come up at what point?
It's something I think we'll discuss with Gray and we can, and relevant services, and we'll make sure, take that into account there.
Councillor Carter first and Councillor Wilson.
Yeah, I think I've asked this question a couple of times before, so forgive me if I've just not remembered the answer. And this is informed by time in the private sector, sitting on an IT strategy board that assesses proposals to invest in IT and assesses impact versus what was predicted. Does the council go back and audit the performance, the financial performance of IT investments after they've been made? Because they won't be made based on we're going to achieve these different objectives, some of which might be cost savings or revenue generation, and either they do or they don't. Is that something that is part of audit? And if so, is that something that can and should be considered by this committee, or does it go elsewhere?
I mean, in terms of internal audit, we build into our plans where, for instance, there's a new system being planned or considered, and we may do a review of that. But I think probably more from our focus, it'd be more about how effective is the system, the controls in place. So I'm not sure it'd be that explicitly necessarily from that angle. Maybe other functions perhaps would link in with that.
Yeah, I think, I'm not aware we necessarily do, but I'm just wondering how appropriate, because a lot of the investment we've done is specifically around infrastructure. So getting the systems up to the level that they need to be, so the security aspects of the systems right. We do bring in software changes. Rollout of M365, we've looked at CRM, and I think we're not necessarily taking money out of the budget and bringing them in. Some of them are necessities. CRM was a necessity. I suppose it's the business planning behind what's new, what's next, and are we putting savings into the budget on the strength of it. I think it's horses for courses really. We've not really done it so far. And I reiterate what I said before, taking savings out of the organisation for digital improvements is really difficult. But it's something we can look at. I think we'll just have to see what the investment was and how specific investments were.
Thank you.
Councillor Wilson.
Thanks, Chair. I think this is something that you might be interested in, whether it's too niche for this committee. I'm not certain, but regarding solar on schools, there is a line in the risk report on climate risk that mentions that the council is working on getting solar panels on a solitary school in Trafford, thanks to a fund, a great amount, a GMCA project. But just this year we got, for a community energy scheme, we got 946 solar panels on Wellington School, for a community energy scheme that is due to be paying an interest rate of 5% per annum to the investors. Given that return and the fact that surely it'd be a good thing if we got solar on our schools more quickly, is it possible in this committee to get some kind of report or intelligence on whether what extent of our school estate is suitable for solar panels, and what options would there be to finance that? Whether it's from the Public Works Loans Board or green bonds or something like that. Are there what kind of structures can we look at so that we can stop doing schools one or two at a time and look at a much wider programme to do it much quicker and to bring those savings in electricity and in our carbon budget that would bring over, over time.
So we will have, I think in the March meeting, an update on that climate risk, so maybe something I can feed through now to the department and to be thinking about.
Yeah, it would be good to have something specific on that, and it feeds into what we can do in those kind of areas on a wider level. So I know other councils are, and I've raised it before here, looking at our issuing green bonds and things like that to fund things. But with solar, it's kind of a spend to save.
I'll feed it through into whether there's some updates on that, if there's any information can have, and maybe something we can build into it in your presentation as well, make reference to that.
I'm not sure I should declare some sort of interest in that you mentioned JMCR, but I'm going to the school where they're doing it, but not through JMCR, just spending their own money on it, because given the cost of energy to schools nowadays, it's a good investment, isn't it? So it's a school where they've just decided to do it themselves.
Well, they'll make more money if they do it themselves, or they'll save more money if they do it themselves. But obviously that takes a large capital outlay that isn't necessarily available to all schools. I think I should probably declare an interest as well, although it is in my declarations are already in the council, so I think that's probably.
I hope it's in my, I think it is, yeah.
Yes, if it's not, you probably should.
Okay, Jim, sorry.
So, I think it's just look at all different types of stuff. There's about community bonds, community municipal investment. I'm just looking up because I kind of looked into this a while ago. I think I have shared it with Joe some of this, but I just think we need to be more imaginative and creative. I mean, with the GMCR solar offer, we we kind of stopped trying to pursue it because it's kind of barriers because the schools, because of the loans on the roof, that they don't own the roof, the council owns the roof of the school, so it got a little bit complicated. But it's like how do we facilitate these kind of things and make use of different kind of funding is really important.
Yeah, and apart from the schools, we've got other buildings where we're quite sure are they our buildings, are we a tenant there, are we joint owners with the NHS or something. So there's quite a lot, and the council have other information about private buildings, which we've had access on. It's data protection because the council knows through the rates who the owners are, but it's not necessarily information they can give to GMCR or other people. Sorry.
No, I just think there's an interesting concept because the fact that it's complex, it's not as easy. Would this be work that scrutiny, the main scrutiny committee can do? Because they can actually dig down much further and investigate all the options and whether it's feasible. And as you said, some schools may have already done it. If they don't, it can pass on their information because you can do it through a task and finish group rather than and come back in. But also you're asking, you're saying that spend, we've just heard the environment. Any loose money going around, spend to invest, and I understand that, and I think it's a good concept. It's only when you've got, I think in some ways, spare cash. And given the budgets that we've got at the moment, you're talking about sustainable budgets, you've got to look at it in around it, and I think it would be better for scrutiny.
I'd be delighted if scrutiny would like to consider it. Yes, I mean, certainly not talking about spending the councils from the regular budget. This would definitely be coming from something like the Public Works Notice Board or raising, green bonds from residents. So residents have a stake in it, and rather than, it certainly wouldn't be something that I recommend. Because it pays back over time, and that's the point. It's an investment vehicle.
And investors say, right,
Yeah.
I just think it needs an in-depth look at it, and I think scrutiny would be a better vehicle to look at that. And actually, I suppose we could say to scrutiny, because we are supposed to have a relationship with scrutiny, is to actually look at that.
Yeah, and we've already got, I think we've got 3 possibilities to start and finish, which already started after January, so we can have that to see what people want to do.
Can we ask if scrutiny will allow us to set up a task and finish selection? We don't do we? Sorry. Is it? Oh.
Which is why I'm saying,
Yeah.
suggesting they are the only ones that can do it. It do go on the work program, because I actually, it depends on what you say,
It could also perhaps leave member for the green environment, say, Councillor Williams. You cut out all the scrutiny and just say, you really ought to be looking at this. Can you get back to us on it?
Yeah, I've already informed him.
Well, in that case,
In
either he's interested or he's not.
Sorry?
Either he's interested or he's not.
I think it's just limited resources, not over time to look at it. I mean, I think that's why I just start to finish groups with ODIT.
Still requires him to do it.
So just to clarify then, are we going to ask scrutiny to look at this?
But if we can have a, part of that reporting.
It can be reflected.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, I think that's, okay. So the urgent business I have none, and I've been notified.
None, Chair.
Thanks very much. So that's the end of the meeting. We just, not quite at half past, but we made it very well. Thank you.
Yeah.